Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Anime Top Scholars Cinema. I hope you enjoyed our last show, where we talked about Look Back. Tonight, we've got another emotional roller coaster for you to feast your eyes and ears upon. We're going to be talking about the 2016 award-winning drama, A Silent Voice. But before the show starts, I just want to say this. If you're sensitive to topics surrounding bullying and/or suicide, then this video might not be for you. And as always, there will be spoilers in this video, but I will do my best to mark those sections so that you can skip them if you so choose. Now with all that out of the way, I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Now, I'm sure most of you already know about this movie, but if you don't, Koa no Katachi, otherwise known as A Silent Voice in English, is a 2-hour-long psychological drama movie from 2016 produced by Kyoto Animation. It was directed by Naoko Yamada, who has also directed anime like K-On!, Tamako Market, and Listen to Bluebird. The anime is based on a manga of the same name, written and illustrated by Yoshitoki Oima. The movie also features Reiko Yoshida, who wrote the scripts, Futoshi Nishiya, who did the character designs, and Kensuke Ushio, who made the music. So in the story we follow the main characters Shoya Ishida and Shoko Nishimiya. The story starts off in elementary school, 6th grade, when Shoko transfers to the same school as Shoya. All she wants to do is fit in and make new friends. But that's an issue. Shoko is deaf, so she can't communicate with the other kids without the help of her notebook. But Shoya and his friends do not like that they have to change the way they interact just to try and include this weird and different transfer student. So they do as kids often do when faced with something they don't understand. They start bullying her. It starts off as light ribbing and saying mean things about her since they know that she can't hear them anyways. But eventually, it escalates into screaming in her ears and stealing her hearing aids and the notebook, throwing them away. Eventually, Shoko's mother gives notice to the school that her daughter is getting bullied, and Shoya ends up getting thrown under the bus by everyone, resulting in him getting bullied himself, which results in his friend group splitting up. The news even reaches his mother, who takes him to apologize and pay Shoko and her mother back for all the damaged hearing aids. And this is the first time Shoya sees that his actions have not only hurt someone he doesn't care about, but they are now also hurting someone close to him. This starts sending him down a journey of self-loathing. All the way through middle school, he gets treated as an outcast, as his reputation as a bully follows him. And now in high school, he has become a complete loner who can't even look others in the face. But he feels like he deserves it all for the way he treated a deaf girl in 6th grade. And so he makes a tough decision. He is going to end it all. He gets a part-time job to make money to pay back his own mother, and then goes to jump off a bridge. However, he fails to go through with it, and instead decides to go through with a different plan. He wants to befriend Shoko as a way to make himself feel better for what he did in the past. He's even studied sign language just so he can talk to her, which is coincidentally also where he met her again. And so, the bulk of the movie involves him and Shoko now hanging out together, but realizing that the past doesn't let go quite that easily. Alright, so let's take a step back and examine this setup and the spoiler-free part of the story. So obviously, bullying is the major catalyst for everything that happens in this movie. I really like how they decide to show that bullying is a bigger issue than just one person or a small group of people being mean to or hurting someone. They show that in an environment where no one really cares and this sort of behavior is allowed to foster, it will spread and simply change targets when convenient. Kids are little pieces of shit, but for the majority of them, it's not really their fault. They don't really understand right and wrong any better than what has already been explained to them, which usually only involves incredibly serious stuff like crimes. What essentially happens is that some random outsider shows up and is completely different from everyone else, and now they are being forced to change the way they act and interact just to accommodate this one person. So as an act of defiance, the group tries to push her away instead, making sure she knows she's not welcome. However, as Shoko keeps trying to remain non-confrontational and just apologize and try to better fit in, this leads to the bullying getting more and more extreme until it eventually hits a point where it can no longer be ignored. And that leads to the teacher calling out Shoya in front of the whole class because everyone knows he's been bullying Shoko, and he is the one who took it the furthest. Does this fix the bullying? Of course not. Now they've just created another bully victim and everyone goes back to not really caring about the main issue because they feel like the situation has been solved. But Shoko still gets bullied, and now Shoya gets bullied too. So yeah, I have to give major credit to this movie for a very good depiction of bullying. Now, one thing that I'm not that into and find a little weird in this movie is how Shoko is so interested in befriending and interacting with people that bully her. I'm not sure if this is a cultural thing or if it's the experience of someone who has grown up deaf, but in my own experience with bullying, the victim usually wanted to avoid the bullies. So that whole thing feels a little strange to me. But at least they fixed that a little bit later, where they show that Shoko is a little more apprehensive about Shoya approaching her again, and he actually has to show that he's trying in good faith to interact with her. Though for my personal taste, she's still a bit too forgiving. Remember, it's not like he just said mean things about her, he even physically hurt her. I'd definitely not be anywhere near as forgiving, and would rather put that part of my life behind me in a similar situation. So yeah, some of the actions that get taken by Shoko, and even some of the other characters, can at times feel more like they are in service of the story than logical actions taken by people in similar circumstances. Now as we continue talking about the story, we're going to be going into the heavy spoiler stuff, so if you want to skip this part, then check the description or video timeline for chapters. The first sign of Shoya having changed comes when he encounters a student who is having trouble with a bully wanting to take his bike from him. He sees this and hears the distressed student screaming for help. Shoya doesn't really want to get involved, but for some reason he decides to do it anyways. So he tells the bully that he can just take his bike instead. And to no one's surprise, the bully takes the bike, never returns it. However, the student he saved, who introduces himself as Tomohiro Nagatsuka, decides to pay back his favor and finds and returns Shoya's missing bike. And just like that, Shoya has made his first friend since elementary school. Now as Shoya is still trying to reconnect with Shoko, he ends up running into Yuzuru, Shoko's boyfriend. Okay, not actually, she's her little sister. But she doesn't want him seeing her older sister and tries to get in their way. However, after Tomohiro gets involved, Shoya and Shoko get together and go to feed the koi fish in the river. But as they talk, Shoko decides that she wants to have a look in the notebook she used during elementary school. Shoya tries to stop her, knowing that there's a lot of not very nice things written in there, but they end up dropping the notebook in the river, and the deaf girl jumps in to get it. Totally surprised, Shoya decides to do the same. But this gets captured on photo by Yuzuru and gets posted on a fake Twitter account made in his name, which sees him get suspended from school, as jumping into the river is against the law. Now suspended, he gets asked to go and pick up his niece from kindergarten, and ends up running into Yuzuru, who's ran away from home after a fight with Shoko, which came about as a result of her actions that ended up getting Shoya suspended. He ends up inviting her to his house for dinner, where they end up getting closer. Moving on from this, Shoya wants to get Shoko's number so that they can text. But his brilliant strategy is to awkwardly get Shoko to ask him for his number. However, she instead says she wants Miyoko Sahara's number. This was one of the few girls in elementary school who was trying to become Shoko's friend. But because of this, she ended up getting bullied herself. Now, Shoya has no idea how to get in contact with her, so he decides to ask his classmate Miki Kawai, who was their class president in elementary school, if she has Miyoko's number. She doesn't, but she knows what school she goes to, so Shoya and Shoko take a train to go and meet with Miyoko. The two girls end up picking up from where they left off and started getting along really well right from the reunion. Shoya, however, feels like quite the third wheel and excuses himself, saying he needs to go to the bathroom and decides to leave the girl alone. However, by chance he ends up running into a familiar face handing out flyers for a cat cafe. Naoka Ueno, one of his female friends from elementary school, who was also quite active in bullying Shoko. She tries to weasel her way back into his life, but is surprised to see the two hanging out together and being friends. However, unlike Shoya, she has no interest in apologizing or becoming friends with Shoko. If anything, she actively despises the girl because she blames her for splitting up their friend group and ruining their lives. However, she will tag along as this new friend group goes out to have fun at an amusement park. However, while this should be a fun time spent with friends, it instead makes Shoya feel quite a bit guilty because he doesn't feel like he deserves to have fun given his past actions. However, that fun and happiness is short-lived, as Naoka and Shoko have an inevitable fight and past issues get dragged up again. Shoya wants to be honest with people about what happened in the past. However, Miki does not want her new friends and classmates to know about her past, so she decides to expose Shoya as a bully in the past before he can do it himself, also that she can save face and not have her reputation tarnished by her own inclusion in the bullying. This leads to Shoya calling all of his old and new friends out on their bullshit, and how they haven't changed at all. also knowing deep down that he hasn't really changed himself. He's just trying to forget the past and move on, but he realizes that he's never even apologized to Shoko for what he did in the past. He simply tried becoming her friend so that he can feel less guilty about rejecting her and bullying her. So Shoya once again decides to isolate himself from his friends and decides to only focus on Shoko and Yuzuru. And with their grandmother passing, he takes them to the countryside to cheer them up. However, he gets hit with the realization that his presence in Shoko's life is hurting her. You see, she blames herself for how Shoya's life has turned out and feels like her presence is causing him pain. So after they get together at the fireworks festival, she excuses herself, saying she has to go home and study. However, Yuzuru tells Shoya to go and grab her camera from the apartment, and when he goes inside, he spots Shoko climbing the balcony, preparing to jump. In full panic, he runs out and manages to grab her hand just after she's jumped. And using all of his strength, he attempts to pull her back up. But instead, he ends up tipping over the ledge and falls into the river below. Now in a coma, all hell is breaking loose. When Naoka learns of what has happened, she spends her time watching over Shoya, refusing Shoko to see him. She even physically assaults both Shoko and her mother. However, Shoya's mother comes in to break them up and goes to talk to Shoko, who has a full breakdown in front of her, crawling at her feet and apologizing profusely, blaming herself for everything that's happened. However, his mother forgives her. One night, Shoko has a dream about a farewell visit from Shoya. Meanwhile, Shoya ends up waking up from his coma. He escapes from the hospital and makes his way to the bridge where he often met with Shoko and finds her there crying. He finally decides to do what he should have done a long time ago and apologizes for bullying her in the past. He also tells her not to blame herself for what has happened and how things have turned out for him. He also tells her that he originally planned to unalive himself, but that he's decided against doing that and wants Shoko to help him keep on living. Something that she agrees to do. And when he finally returns to school with Shoko in tow, he reunites with his friends and gets told that he can lift his head, finally being able to look others in the face, knowing that he has redeemed himself for the actions of his past. Oh boy, there's a lot to go through here. So let's start with how Shoya is slowly starting to piece his life back together, but still is unable to shake his past. Through helping another guy deal with his bully, he ends up making the first friend in ages. This really is the beginning of him starting to gain some of that lost confidence he had, and finally starts making a more active effort in befriending Shoko. And in doing so, he also kind of inadvertently starts reaching out to people he used to know, which leads him to regain contact with people he used to be friends with, but stopped after he was branded as a bully. It's actually interesting how even such a minor thing starts getting the stone rolling on him truly confronting his past. But at this point, we're still far from actually getting there. But I think this is pretty strong character writing. Efforts are being made to change and develop, but it's more nuanced and well developed than simply having the character actively decide to change and then goes and fixes all his problems. People aren't that simple, and we often won't do the simple thing even if it could fix a lot of the problems we'd created for ourselves. So following up on that, he suddenly finds himself with a new friend group that consists of some new friends and some old friends. Wow, he's truly fixed himself and moved on, hasn't he? Of course not, and you can tell because he's essentially unable to feel comfortable with his current situation. Like, everyone is getting along on the surface, but it feels wrong somehow, like some important step has been missed. And that's because it has. Nothing has actually changed. Everyone is just pretending like the past hasn't happened. The reason for that is that it's easier and more convenient for all parties involved. Well, everyone except one, or two if you want to be really specific about it. Naoka is not happy with the current situation because she refuses to let go of her belief that Shoko ruined their life. So she holds a grudge against the girl and even confronts her about it in a Ferris wheel. This clearly shows us that not everything is okay and that they can't truly move on from the past like this. They are essentially doing the exact same thing that allowed the bullying and discontent to sow back in elementary school. And if just ignored, things will go down the same road. And that's exactly what happens. Shoya wants to make peace with his past, so he wants to be honest about what happened. Naoka wants things to return to how they were before Shoko showed up, and Miki wants to keep her perfect image untainted and decides to throw Shoya under the bus. And Miyoko is simply scared and wants to run away when things get tough. So as suspected, it leads to Shoya breaking down, saying the quiet part out loud about all his friends, and once again ends up alienating himself from them. But now he also does the same for his new friends like Tomohiro. Once again, this to me is incredibly good writing. They acknowledge that nothing has actually changed, and things only appear to be healing on the surface. But beneath it all, there's still so much unresolved tension that it eventually ends up exploding. So clearly, he's gonna have to try again. His next course of action is to only focus on Shoko and Yuzuru, because the conclusion that he has come to is that he can't fix what happened in the past. So let's just forget about it. Now he's only gonna focus on the sisters and making sure they are happy. What we have arrived at here is worse than stagnation. It's character regression. But unlike what you'll usually hear in a review, where character development is good and regression is bad, that's not the case in this movie, because the regression is used actively to drive home a point. Shoya has decided that he can be happy simply shutting out the past and everyone involved with it. But you know who can't be happy with that? That's right, Shoko. All of Shoya's selfish actions are hurting her, because all she's essentially getting out of this friendship is seeing a person she has come to care about hurt himself because of her. This, coupled with her own problems and destructive way of thinking about herself, essentially drives her up against the wall and makes her choose her own easy escape. If her being part of Shoya's and everyone's life, including her own family, is such a net negative, then simply disappearing will make everyone heal, right? But obviously no one actually wants this, and she's essentially trying to escape her own issues rather than dealing with them. Because it's easy. It's convenient. But since her plan backfires and ends up hurting everyone even more, she's essentially at the end of her rope. What can actually be done to rectify this situation? Well, we have now arrived at the most important part. Actually addressing the elephant in the room, and finally moving forward and changing for the better. With Shoya escaping the hospital, he once again meets up with Shoko. And finally realizing what a mess this whole thing has become, he decides to do what he realistically should have done from the beginning. He apologizes to her. We have finally arrived at what should have been step 1 when you think about it logically. But because everyone involved are emotional creatures and ultimately pretty selfish, step 1 has always been skipped, and instead we have decided to try to move straight on to forgiveness and forgetting. This is the emotional conclusion to a very strong story, not simply about a deaf girl who had to deal with bullying or suicidal thoughts, but a story about people, about emotions, and about how illogical we can be when something is simply uncomfortable. And that is why I think A Silent Voice is a very strong movie. However, I still think it lacks a little something, particularly in regards to Shoko. At the end, Shoya gets his big moment where he finally realizes that he's been forgiven and can once again lift his head and face others head on. But what about Shoko? Well, she's had to accept that she's different and that there will always be challenges for people who choose to be friends with her. She is essentially needing to learn to love herself more, despite her very obvious flaws. But ultimately, at the end, her purpose and reason for continuing is just to ensure that Shoya wants to keep on living. It's an incredibly selfless act. Almost too selfless. Now, she's clearly always been a very selfless character who didn't like seeing others have to change on her behalf. But that makes it kind of awkward how her resolution is basically just doubling down on that specific character trait. It almost feels like everyone else fought for change, but ultimately, she has to accept that she needed to remain true to herself. It makes sense in the sense that as a deaf girl, she's unable to change that part about her, so she's less in need of changing her character. However, I still wish we would have seen her have to deal with some of her own issues, and at least make a small change. The obvious thing that comes to mind would have been actually taking a stand about Naoka, the only girl in this whole movie who truly hates her. Ultimately, she has her own little character development at the end as well, so it almost feels a little bit unjustified that she gets to start her own road towards change, but the second main character simply gets robbed of her opportunity to do the same. If they could have fixed this issue, A Silent Voice would have been, in my mind, an almost perfect movie. So we need to go through the themes that are present in this movie. The first and most obvious one is literally given to us in the title. A silent voice. What is that? Well, it's the voice inside your own head. That annoying thing that tells you all the negative things you think about. It reinforces all your mistakes. It makes you feel guilty. It can eat you up inside. We spend most of this movie being shown Shoya's guilt, and his own thoughts around what he did in the past and how he feels he will never be able to make up for what he did, and how he now deserves all the shit that's been given to him. A particular scene of note in regards to this is how, while in high school, he sits alone and watches his classmates as they are talking together. The entire time he is monologuing about what they're actually talking about, usually defaulting to them talking shit about him as he sees that they notice he's looking at them. It really shows where his mind is at the moment, and that even when no one is talking to him, that inner voice of his is still talking down to him, reminding him of his past actions. However, through his actions, we also see that he wants to do something about that. But in a more selfish way, he decides to just befriend the girl he used to bully instead of actually apologizing to her. However, at the end, he obviously gets there and finally apologizes, meaning that he can finally put his past behind him. But it's not just his silent voice that's a factor in this movie, it's also Shoko's. We don't really get to see much of that throughout the movie, but at the end it's also being made abundantly clear that she is also suffering from doubts, being incredibly frustrated with her own disability, and also blames herself for ruining someone else's life. But not only that, she laments being different. So much so that she's wanted to unalive herself in the past as well. Both her mother and younger sister tried hard to cheer her up and not make her think such dark thoughts. It really shows us how much the things that's happened to her has actually affected her, even though it didn't really seem like it at the start of the movie. This obviously culminates in her attempt, which instead results in Shoya getting hospitalized. The last theme I want to highlight from this movie is that of human nature. You see, this movie has a very simple premise with a clearly defined end goal. But also, so much pain and suffering could have been avoided had the characters simply acted rational and just realized their mistakes and apologized at the earliest convenience. So why not just do that? Are the writers stupid? The reason is that this movie is ultimately about people. People are not just logical creatures, we are also emotional creatures. We act on impulse. We act based on if something makes us feel good or bad. We, in specific situations, don't really think, because it goes against our animal instincts. So while the conclusion essentially can be boiled down to, should have just done the logical thing from the start and none of this would have happened, that is exactly the point. All this pain and suffering did happen because human nature, and how even the simplest solution can sometimes be the hardest thing to actually do, just because it's uncomfortable. It forces you to face yourself and acknowledge your own issues. And while instead just trying to escape your own problems is easy and convenient, that silent voice inside of your head can eat away at you until it's too late. So, this is a bit of a difficult one for me to review. Not because of personal experiences or anything like that, but instead because this is the second time I watched this movie. And my opinion on it has kind of changed. On my first watch, I had problems with accepting the character's actions as believable. I felt like it didn't quite make sense, and felt that there were better ways to handle the character of Shoya, who has this weird flip from confident and abrasive little shit to remorseful and timid teen. However, on my second watch, my opinion has kind of changed. Now I feel like what they were trying to showcase was less so a change in his character, as much as it's showing us the results of him having distanced himself from others. Plus, he also clearly wants to go back to being that confident kid he used to be, but he feels like he can't do that with a guilty conscience. And the only way to clear his conscience is to become friends with the person he rejected in the past. So yeah, my opinion on the movie is that it's very well done. It handles some extremely heavy subjects without really falling into a whole thing about feeling sorry for someone for their disability, but simply saying that bullying is bad. It instead handles these things with a lot more of an interesting take. It shows us that bullying is not just a one-person problem, but instead a problem caused by a culture that doesn't care and allows it to foster. Simply because people don't want their normal everyday life to be changed or get more complicated. And even Shoko isn't fully blameless for the situation she finds herself in, even if she is the victim of bullying for something that is entirely out of her hands. But this in the past also affected my opinion of it. Knowing how bullying works, having seen it and experienced it, I couldn't relate to a character who seemingly wanted to surround herself with the bullies. And even to this day, I still feel like that is one of the weaker aspects of the movie. It feels like Shoko makes decisions that makes more sense for the story to progress than it does for how you would realistically expect a person to approach being surrounded by others who for a long time made your everyday life a living hell. And when that eventually turns into her falling in love with the boy who bullied her harder than anyone else, that just felt kinda weird. But that said, I can still overlook this flaw because I feel like that's not really the main point of the story. The main point of this story is change. Changing is hard. Very hard. As someone who has spent most of his life trying to change because I didn't like who I was, I know this very well. And that silent voice in your head is constantly there, reminding you of your failures, and of how you're never really gonna be able to fully change. But you don't need to fully change. Even small changes here and there can be good. Even if you're only able to change one bad thing about yourself to a good thing, that's a positive. Shoya wants to change, because he doesn't want to just be the bully his entire life. But try as he might, he is unable to change fully. Even if he doesn't bully anymore, he is still unable to forgive himself for his past actions. But the reason he's unable to forgive himself is because he skipped the most important first step in changing. That is acknowledging that what you did was bad, and apologizing to the person he hurt. As for Shoko, her struggle is that the silent voice in her head is judging her for how her inability to hear is causing problems for everyone around her. People have to change how they act and interact just to include her. And seeing that her very existence is causing conflict between people who were otherwise getting along, she starts to feel really guilty. She just wants to be like everyone else, but her disability doesn't allow it. What she ultimately has to come to terms with is that she is the way she is, nothing can change that. She has to learn to love herself despite that. But she can't really do that until those around her start accepting her for who she is. She also has to accept that not everything is her fault. Yes, she's seeing how her existence is affecting those around her, and conflicts seem to spark among people who were otherwise getting along fine before she showed up. But ultimately, that's not really her fault. These things might have happened eventually, even if she wasn't there, but she is here. And you can't exist and be around people, but also expect to have no impact on their lives or them as people. We all influence other people in one way or another. Shoko just has to accept that she does as well. Alright, that is all I have for you for now. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show and have really gained another appreciation for a silent voice. Or if you've never seen it before, I hope this made you want to check it out. And if you truly enjoyed this show, then I hope you'd be willing to leave a like on this video, a comment down below letting me know your thoughts on the movie, the video itself, or even just the movie you would want me to check out, and also subscribe to my channel to see when I upload the next part in this series. But if you want to see more from me right now, you can still check out the last episode where we talked about Look Back, a drama about manga, creativity, and art, based on a one-shot from the Chainsaw Man mangaka. Or maybe you want to learn a bit more about some legendary people in the anime and or manga industry. I highly recommend that. And with that, I only have one last thing to say to you. Peace.